So you started this book years ago, but I have to say it seemed very, very relevant to today. And I think the thing that is stunning to me, was that Abraham Lincoln was essentially a third party candidate.
Hmm.
He was kind of a nobody up to that point. He's like a former one term member of Congress, rattling around the Midwest. And then there is this new startup party called the Republican Party that just kind of comes out of nowhere.
Yeah,
and and he wins a four-way race with
yeah.
39.8% of the vote. And just as someone, grows up in this country venerating Abraham Lincoln, like I was like, what? You know?
No, and I totally understand why you would gravitate to that part. And I actually originally that section was two or three times as long because I got into like the real like electoral mechanics of how the Whig Party was supplanted by the Republican Party. Which you're right, it's the most successful third party in American history, and there's a lot to learn from it. People think that it's important to remember for folks that our Constitution doesn't mention political parties. It does
No.
mention journalists, I like to point out, but it doesn't mention political parties. And that's because the founding fathers, which was my last book, is about Washington's farewell. He was an independent as a matter of principle. The founding fathers expected that members of Congress would represent their conscience and their constituents, but not through the filter of party. Eventually, within their lifetime, they realized that was perhaps inevitable. But the Federalist Party is supplanted by the Whig Party, which then falls apart because it fails to take a stand on slavery that's distinct and clear, the defining issue of the time. Then there's an anti-immigrant Know Nothing party that emerges that Lincoln refuses to join, although it's the first nativist party that is very resonant today. And then the way the Republican Party is created and how quickly it rises, it's a big tent, moderate progressive party dedicated to opposing slavery. Some people oppose its expansion. Some people want complete abolition. And it really ends up seating the states of the fastest growing areas, the upper Midwest and the Northeast. And Lincoln, after losing his Senate race, but his speeches against slavery and slavery's expansion were so powerful that he developed a national reputation, is sort of this young, fresh faced compromise candidate. He's the moderate from the Midwest, and he has a reputation for honesty, and he's not seen as a radical. As I say, he's a reconciler in a time of radicals and reactionaries, and that rockets him up to lead the nation at the start of the Civil War without any executive experience and no military experience, and one term in Congress. And he succeeds because of his character and because of his capacity to grow. And it's a reminder that the study of history shows very clearly, I think, that character is the single most important quality in a president, bar none.
Most successful third party indeed. So the Republican Party starts out as a northern anti-slave party, which is not the way most people think of it today. I mean, it's kind of reversed roles in terms of dominating the
100%.
South, thanks to the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s.
Hmm.
So Lincoln becomes president, and that almost immediately kicks off the Civil War in
Hmm.
essence, because there were candidates who were vying uh, for votes in the South, neither of whom was Abraham Lincoln. And then when Lincoln won with essentially exclusively Northern support, then the South decides to secede shortly thereafter, and Lincoln finds himself a wartime president with, as you described, very limited experience in that realm.
Yeah, and he wins actually the states in the Pacific, California, Oregon, and I believe Washington at that point. Certainly California and Oregon, but they have you know they have incredibly small populations. And but you're right. It's the energy in the country. His was in the upper Midwest and the Northeast, and that's what he wins. And Lincoln doesn't even appear on the ballot in the Deep South. Um, and what you see also is that the planter class, the slave owners who were pushing secession, never dared initially bring it to a popular vote in the states. They tried to do it in closed partisan conventions, and then they relied on essentially the violence, beginning with the focus on Fort Sumter. Um, that feeling, they knew the feeling of resentment and revenge would create its own kind of remorseless logic, and people thought, well, we'll just have a quick war and get this over with. But of course, that's not what happened. And Lincoln, who really is a man of peace in a time of war, is the least likely guy. But he He studies quickly, he develops a theory of war, and he relies on his interpersonal absence of malice. The defining characteristics I see, he's temperamentally a moderate man, but he combines moderation with moral courage. And I think that's something that you and I share and focus on that's the magic combination that too often is missing. Too many people look at moderates and see an absence of moral courage, and too many people with moral courage assume a sense of moral superiority. And that's not the way to persuade people. Democracy depends on persuasion. And even in the middle of a civil war, what is so extraordinary is that Lincoln still believes that there's more that unites us than divides us. He refuses to demonize people he disagreed with,
Yes.
even when they're calling for his death. He believes that you empathize with your opponents as a means of reasoning with them. It's the politics of the golden rule. And I think it's so inspiring. And it was unusual in his time, too. Don't get me wrong. But it's the reason he's on a higher level than any president or any American political figure.
Yeah, this is a quote that I feel like everyone should take to heart. There's so many Lincoln quotes in this book that I was reminded of. But here's one that spoke to me. If you would win a man to your cause, first convince him you are his sincere friend. But mark him as one to be shamed and despised. He will retreat within himself, close all avenues to his head and his heart. And I think that's totally true.
Yeah, it's totally true.
And it seems like that's a fundamental lesson that everyone just is completely ignored nowadays.
Well, it is, and this is something that you get grief for sometimes in a good faith attempt to reach out and empathize with people and hear where they're coming from. And in the current environment, that basic quality of empathy, let's be honest, has been strained. It's difficult in environments, where people are believing a self-evident big lie pushed by a con man who tried to overturn an election. That's going to strain our capacity for empathy when you see people doubling down on that. But if Lincoln could continue with that spirit of empathy, even in the middle of a civil war, when he would not demonize people he disagrees with, in public or private, that's a tall order. That's a big example. But it really is incumbent upon us to try. We may miss that mark, but it really is incumbent upon us to try, because that's how we get out of this ultimately. I mean, every knowledge of human nature would suggest that, and all the emotional reflexes in politics are set up the other way. But we're going to need to find a way to transcend that, to reconcile again. And so I know that you understand that dynamic.
Oh, he literally had people threatening his life, and he would say, it's okay. Like we'd be doing the same thing in their shoes. I thought that was just an incredible attitude.
Yeah, it's remarkable, especially when you see how he combines opposites. And he does, he personally swings between tragedy and comedy and depression and this sort of tendency to tell jokes all the time, which is really a form of self-medication for him, but which leads other people, his contemporaries, to accuse him of being insufficiently serious. There's that story early in the book where, after a brutal Union defeat, his friend Isaac N. Arnold, the congressman from Illinois, goes to visit him in the White House. And he's sitting on the second floor in front of a fireplace, and he's reading from a book of his favorite humorist, Artemus N. Ward. And Ward, like another of his favorites, Petroleum V. Nasby, play characters. I mean, it's actually it's satire. It's first-person satire in the kind of way that the original Stephen Colbert show did, where they're playing a character. Anyway, Arnold sees him laughing by the fireplace after this brutal Union defeat, and he's furious at his friend. He says, "What the hell are you doing? How can you laugh at a time like this?" And then in Arnold's memoir, he describes Lincoln as throwing down the book and turning to him with tears in his eyes and saying, "Do you not realize that if I could not find some way to get relief, that my heart would break?" And that's when he realized that the laughter and the storytelling and the joking was a form of self-medication, which I think is profound.
I mean, he bore an unbelievable burden. And one of the themes, maybe the predominant theme in the book, is that he thought you needed to lead a hard war and then follow with a very soft peace. And for a man who is not naturally himself militaristic, to be leading a hard war just seemed like an extraordinarily difficult burden to bear. One of the things that also blew my mind was the war drags on and on for 4 years, and then the next election is up, 1864, and people are saying to him, it's like, hey, you don't need to have this election, because guess what, there's a war on, and he insists on having the election,
Hmm.
but there is a period during which he's not favored to win.
Oh, he's convinced he's going to lose. In August, before the election, he circulates a letter that he has written himself predicting his defeat, closes the envelope, seals it, has his cabinet sign it, and it's literally to be witness to his own silent prediction of his defeat. And then of course things change. Importantly, Sherman takes Atlanta, which changes the tone of the war. And and,
and
and you
and,
know,
and the, during this time, the Democrats are running against him, and the Democrats are like, hey, everyone, if you're tired of this war, vote us in, and then we'll have peace with the South and all be well. And you have to hear that and be like, wow, that'd be a pretty compelling pitch, after years and years of war. So like that, I like, and if you can imagine, if he loses that race and the Democrats are like, hey, we're
oh,
in like peace with the South, there is no United States of America as we know it
oh,
today.
everything changes. You know, that's the thing. I mean, he believes that that you have to win on the battlefield and in the election for his vision of a magnanimous peace to work. The book is about how you win a peace, right? The book is about Lincoln's plan to win the peace after winning the war and his vision for national reconciliation and reunification. And what is so extraordinary is he comes up with this without any historic precedent, because there's never been a civil war on that scale before. He comes up with a basic formula that you indicated: unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace. And there were people in his time saying, look, we've lost 750,000 Americans, that let's just have peace. Let's have a ceasefire. He gets brought ceasefire offers from the Confederates on at least two occasions, and he refuses them. Easy political win, right?
Yeah, no, he would
Right.
say the war's over and we won. Like, you feel like 9 out of 10 political leaders would take that.
Yeah. And they would be wrong, because what Lincoln understood was that the political will to end slavery would evaporate
Yes.
if there was a ceasefire before surrender, which is why he'd refuse. He said, no one man desires peace more than I, but I'm unwilling to accept a peace on such terms that would guarantee the next war. If you don't remove the root cause of the war, it's not peace. And so a just war must be followed by a just peace, but you need to end the fundamental underlying issue, which is slavery, and also the idea that states have a right to secede. And so that's why an unconditional surrender needed to precede a magnanimous peace. But even in that, there were people in his own party who want vengeance,
Yeah.
and he's saying, no, that's not the way. We need to build our enemies back up. And we need to, have political reform, economic expansion, move the nation's attention westward, and then cultural reintegration, which will take time, moving toward a multiracial and majoritarian democracy, which is the thing had been fundamentally resisted. But he is so farsighted, and where the book, we may get there in the conversation, but where the book ends up going is that his vision ends up being vindicated in the wake of the Second World War, where we
Yeah.
pursue a policy of unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace, and it works.
Well, some of the signs of the fact that he did want a magnanimous peace is when he talks about letting the Confederate president essentially leave the country, be like, well, hopefully someone can just make sure he gets out, because he doesn't want to execute him, but he also obviously he can't just have him hanging around. And he tells his generals to let him up easy, let everyone go home, let them keep their horses, just want to have to give them back to their families, which would be a very tough stance to hold on to after years and years of conflict, and then people all telling you that after you win, like, we have um, to punish the treasonous rebels. So he presides over the end of a war that he had opportunities to end earlier, but not unconditionally. And so he's like, look, we need an unconditional surrender. Eventually, Robert E. Lee does capitulate and surrenders. And unfortunately, Lincoln is assassinated very, very shortly thereafter. It seems like there's no real opportunity even to celebrate the end of the war before people are cast into mourning.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And the magnanimous peace that Lincoln had been evangelizing for, that seemed to be carrying the day. I mean, he's assassinated 5 days after Lee surrendered Appomattox. The generous terms of which that Grant writes are basically terms that he had received from Lincoln in their detailed meetings. But one of the things that happened is that feeling of magnanimity, of we must reunite the nation, is immediately replaced by a feeling of revenge. So Lincoln's martyrdom helps solidify the Union in some respect, but it also gets us back, ironically, off. It harms his legacy because we get off a path of magnanimity towards one of vengeance. Andrew Johnson is the worst possible person to take over for him, and where Lincoln had wanted the rank and file amnesty, let them have their guns to shoot crows with and their horses to plow with. He as you said, he wasn't going to make a martyr of Jefferson Davis and the Confederate leadership by hanging them, which is the traditional punishment for treason. But he also wasn't going to let the planter class, the people who should have known better, the members of Congress, the courts, the military, who joined the Confederacy. He wasn't going to give them amnesty right away. He wasn't going to let them get their power back because he knew that would end up being a restoration of the slave class, even in the absence of slavery itself, due to the 13th Amendment, which he passed before he died. Which is a reminder, by the way, that even if rights are enshrined in the Constitution, they don't mean anything if they're not enforced. Um, you know, but it just gets us off on precisely the wrong path and the opposite of what Lincoln wanted. But one of the things he did understand: you want magnanimity, but you still need accountability for leadership to precede reconciliation.